Fort Wayne, Indiana, 8-year-old April Tinsley failed to show up for dinner on April 1, 1988. She had been playing with two friends and had gone to get her umbrella but never returned. Her mother called over to the friends' houses and discovered her daughter was not at either home. She immediately called the police. A search party quickly gathered with over 200 officers and 50 volunteers from the neighborhood. This close-knit community was devastated by a missing child and rallied to support April's mother. During canvassing, a witness came forward saying she saw a white male in his 30s driving a blue pickup truck in the area. The witness said she saw the truck pull over for a little girl walking down the road, and the child entered the vehicle. She said it looked like a relative or a parent picking up a child and saw nothing suspicious about the interaction. Police ran a sketch of the witness account. A jogger discovered April's body on April 4th in a ditch in Spencerville, Indiana. Police determined she had been deceased for 1 or 2 days before discovery. She had only been in the ditch for about 4 hours. Near the scene, they found one of Tinsley's shoes and a sex toy in a shopping bag a few miles down the road. They recovered Tinsley's other shoe, as if the killer had noticed the shoe was still in his vehicle, threw it out the window as he was driving. A motorist came forward saying he saw a blue pickup truck in the area in the early morning hours pulled over. The autopsy revealed April had been sexually assaulted and was strangled to death. They recovered DNA at the scene, but DNA was still in its infancy and it generated no suspects. Police initially had a suspect who was a known child predator in the area, but the DNA was not a match. The case quickly grew cold. On May 21, 1990, a man called police because he had discovered a message written in crayon on his barn door. The note read, "I killed 8-year-old April M. Tinsley. Did you find the other shoe? Haha, I will kill again." Police were certain that the message was written by the killer because they had never revealed the detail about the second shoe to the media. There had been another murder in June of 1990, 7-year-old Sarah Jean Boker, and it was believed the two murders were connected. However, the FBI ruled that they were unrelated. In 2004, 4 notes were found in the Fort Wayne area believed to have been written by Tinsley's killer. 3 notes were left on girls' bicycles and another was left in a mailbox. The notes were placed in plastic bags along with used condoms and Polaroid pictures of a man's lower body. One of the notes read, "Hi honey, I have been watching you. I am the same person that kidnapped and killed April Tinsley. You are my next if you don't report this to the police and I don't see this in the paper tomorrow or on the local news, I will blow up your house." The DNA in the condoms matched the DNA recovered from April's body. In 2005, the Tinsley family held a press conference asking for leads in the case, and in June 2009, Indiana authorities asked the FBI Child Abduction Task Force to help them solve the murder. The FBI profiled the killer as a white male in his 40s to 50s living in the area, who was a preferential child sex offender with a low to medium income. They believed he would be unlikely to contain his desires and would probably kill again. In 2009, the Tinsley murder was featured on America's Most Wanted, which ran a segment asking for tips. In 2015, a genetic reconstruction company released a snapshot composite sketch of a suspect based on how he would look according to his DNA. Police aged the suspect and re-released the photo in 2016. In 2018, the Fort Wayne Police Department sent a sample of the suspect's DNA to a company that used genealogy from public sources like Ancestry DNA or 23andMe to reverse engineer a family tree. From this, they narrowed the DNA down to 2 brothers. They began following the 2 brothers, one being 59-year-old John D. Miller. Using Miller's trash, they were able to make a positive match to the killer of April Tinsley. Detectives approached Miller, read him his rights, and asked if he knew why they were there. Miller replied, "April Tinsley." When he was arrested, he confessed and pleaded guilty. He was sentenced in 2019 to 80 years in prison. April's family have created a memorial garden called April's Garden. They hold an annual walk to honor April and other child victims. 18-year-old Tanya and 20-year-old Jay left Victoria, BC on a ferry to Port Angeles, Washington on November 18, 1987. Cook had borrowed his father's van for the trip and planned to camp overnight in Seattle and purchase some parts for Cook's father. The couple had been dating for 6 months. They both lived at home still and were excited for a getaway. Upon arrival in Port Angeles, they drove down Route 101 and boarded a second ferry to Seattle. The couple was last seen leaving the Bremerton Ferry Terminal, and when the couple did not return the next day as they had planned to, the families of the couple became concerned. And on November 20th, they called police. 4 days later, Tanya's half-naked body was recovered in a ditch by a rural road in Algiers, Washington. She had been raped, bound with zip ties, and shot in the head. Initially, Cook's family had been warned that they were looking at Jay as the primary suspect. His family knew he would never have killed anyone, and his family were vindicated when hunters found Jay Cook's body 60 miles from where Tanya was found. He had been strangled and beaten with rocks, and it was speculated that Cook had died first. His body dumped, and then Tanya was abducted and killed further away. Tanya's wallet and keys were found discarded at a Greyhound busway. Inside the van, they found more plastic ties, the same that were used to bind Tanya, plastic gloves, receipts from along the trip, as well as DNA believed to be the killer's. The family noted that Tanya's camera was missing, and they were certain she had it with her when she left. The DNA recovered didn't match anyone in any criminal databases, but because the killer had used gloves, the police speculated that the killer was taunting police, and they thought the killer may have experience with the prison system. Investigators believe that the couple had picked up a hitchhiker or perhaps even had met them on the ferry. For several years, the families of the victims received numerous cards taunting them for the deaths of their loved ones. Police eventually found the man responsible, a homeless man located in Canada, who had mental health issues and confessed to sending the letters at a very low point in his life. He had wanted to apologize to the families for their cruelty. Police determined this man had no connection to the murders. On May 18, 2018, a 55-year-old Seattle man was taken into custody after his DNA matched the DNA collected from the scene nearly 3 decades back. Police used reverse DNA genealogy analysis, the same tactic used to put away the Golden State Killer only a month previous. William Earl Talbot II would have been 24 years old at the time of the murders. Tanya's body had been 6 miles from his parents' home. He worked as a truck driver for the last 20 years. He had no criminal record except for a charge of indecent exposure, and he was never a suspect or had been tipped to the police prior to the DNA connection. He was charged in the abduction, rape and murder of Tanya von Kohlenberg and the murder of Jay Cook. Talbot is now being investigated for other crimes in the area, as well as locating Tanya's camera. His trial will begin June of 2019. On March 26, 1986, 12-year-old Michelle Welsh was babysitting her 2 younger sisters at a park in Tacoma, Washington. Michelle got on her bike to return home to make some more sandwiches for the girls. While Michelle was gone, her sisters went to nearby businesses to use the washroom. They had also made a call home to check in on their older sister and let her know where they were, but no one picked up. Michelle returned to the park and was unable to locate her sisters. She was last seen at 1:30 p.m. talking to an unidentified man. Her sisters returned to the park, waited, and Michelle didn't return. Then the investigation was the man that Welsh had last spoken to in the park. He had been described as possibly Hispanic, 25 to 35, 5 feet 8 inches, with black hair and a possible mustache. Another suspect was a man seen in the park observing young girls, and he was described as 24 to 25, 5 feet 9 inches and skinny, wearing dirty, ripped clothing. Sketches were drawn up for the 2 sightings, but the leads ran cold quickly. Police had also looked into a known child killer, David Fisher, but the police couldn't connect him to the area of the crime. There had been a similar murder case in the area, Jenny Bastian, a 13-year-old who had been sexually assaulted and strangled in the Tacoma area. Her body had also been found in a remote, wooded area, and police were certain the murders were connected, being only 6 months apart and the same area. DNA evidence collected from the scenes determined the killers were different men. Jenny Bastian's murderer was located in Illinois. He had been in the police database. In the Welsh investigation, her murderer didn't appear to be in any databases, but in 2016, police hired a genetic genealogy to be done on the DNA evidence, and they were able to narrow down the search to 2 brothers. Gary Hartman had remained in the area his entire life. Police put both men under surveillance and observed Gary Hartman while he was in a restaurant. He used a napkin several times, and the police were able to collect the napkin and get a positive DNA match. They arrested the 66-year-old man the following day during a traffic stop. Gary Hartman spent the last 2 decades working as a nurse. He had worked in the Western State Hospital as a community nurse specialist. He had no formal complaints and no criminal record. Welsh denies these charges. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. Harvey Eugene Whitaker, who went by Gene, was born in Kokomo, Indiana on October 6, 1926. He was a very responsible and disciplined young man. He grew up on a farm with numerous siblings, with whom he was close, and worked as a typesetter for the local newspaper. He joined the Army shortly after he graduated high school. He managed to rise to the rank of corporal in under 2 years. In the summer of 1947, 20-year-old Gene was in the Engineer Corps, assigned to the Armed Forces Special Weapons Project at the top-secret Sandia base, which was located on the outskirts of Albuquerque, New Mexico. Gene failed to report for roll call on the morning of July 1, 1947. This immediately signaled trouble to his superiors, as Gene was a dependable soldier who they could not imagine abandoning his duties. Gene did not smoke or drink, and had never gone absent without leave before. The previous evening, Gene had been at a bowling alley in Albuquerque with an Army bowling league. He was an above-average bowler, and because he was so trustworthy, he was made the treasurer of the league. 2 days after Gene went missing, his glasses, shirt, hat, and necktie were found in an alley near the bowling alley. The shirt was bloody. Tears in the fabric indicated that Gene may have been stabbed twice in the back, while he was still wearing the shirt. While some of his belongings had been found, there was still no sign of Gene himself or of his body. It was estimated that Gene had between $400 and $500 with him the night he vanished because of his role as the treasurer of the bowling league. However, the fact that Gene's body was not left behind, even if he had been killed during a simple robbery, and his position within the military led to concerns that his disappearance may have had national security implications. The Armed Forces Special Weapons Project had taken over atomic weapons development from the Manhattan Project following World War II. Sandia was a top-secret base, meaning Gene potentially had access to important and sensitive information. This led to fears that Gene had been abducted by someone who was hoping to extract top-secret information about the base or its projects from him. Gene reportedly had done work connected to the top-secret guided missile program. Spy activities had recently been discovered at the nearby base at Los Alamos. As such, the FBI joined local and military authorities in investigating the disappearance. The War Department ultimately dismissed the possibility that Gene had information worth killing for, but the FBI remained actively investigating the case for several more years. Investigators also considered the possibility that Gene had deserted. They questioned his family members and tapped their phones, hoping to find evidence of Gene contacting them. The last piece of correspondence between Gene and anyone in his family was a letter he sent to his sister Rose, but it was dated June 23rd, a week before he disappeared. Gene's bank account in Indiana was monitored but never touched. Gene was declared legally dead in January of 1954. Many, but not all of his relatives accepted the theory that he had been murdered during a robbery. His niece, Patty Mawson, however, believes that the circumstances surrounding her uncle's disappearance are highly suspicious and continues to work on his case to this day. She is upset that all of Gene's siblings died without knowing what happened to him and by the fact that he is still technically considered AWOL and a deserter. By the Army, she has filed a Freedom of Information Act request to get files from the FBI about the case and told that approximately 200 pages from his file are available, although the copies she will receive will have certain information redacted. However, she has been waiting for more than 3 years to receive the documents and has been told that there are 485 requests ahead of hers that have to be fulfilled first. The items of jeans that were found in the alley also appear to have gone missing. They were never logged into evidence with police in Albuquerque, and federal agencies do not appear to have record of where they are. In addition to getting answers about what happened to her uncle, Patty hopes to locate these items. If she cannot honor her uncle by finding his remains and giving him a proper burial, she hopes to at least bury these items so that there will be a location where Jean can be memorialized. 17-year-old Yvonne Regler lived in Lorain, Ohio, and was a student at North Olmsted High School. Her best friend was her brother, Dan. It was only a year apart from her in age. On August 8, 1977, Yvonne reported for work at the Sunoco gas station on Lorain Road in North Olmsted, Ohio. She was only at the station for about an hour before she was asked to work instead at a station approximately 3 miles away in Fairview Park. The attendant working there that morning was a mechanic, and his skills were needed at the North Olmsted station. Yvonne did not have a car, so one of her co-workers drove her to the other station. At the time, the station in Fairview Park was transitioning from being full service to self-service. On this particular day, only one gas pump was operational and was full service. At 10:30 that morning, Yvonne spoke to one of her friends on the phone. They discussed the upcoming funeral they were attending for the father of one of their friends and the dress Yvonne had purchased for the service. Despite the somber topic of conversation, the friend reported that Yvonne was in good spirits during this call. Yvonne then had another conversation over the phone about the funeral, this time with one of her family members at 11 a.m. The manager at the North Olmsted station dropped off lunch for Yvonne at noon, and half an hour later, 2 teenage girls saw her at the gas station. Yvonne spoke to her friend on the phone again sometime between 12:30 and 1 p.m. The friend could hear the service bell ding over the line, and Yvonne told them that a car had driven through but left the station. The friend heard the bell sound again, and Yvonne told them that the same car was back. Yvonne then said that she would call the friend again after her shift ended at 3 o'clock. Yvonne initialed the receipt when a customer used a credit card to buy gas at 1:25 p.m. Between 1:30 and 2:05, 3 people, 2 customers and a coffee machine repairman, came into the station and found no one there. They were not alarmed, however, and did not contact police. The employee who came to take over for Yvonne when her shift ended was alarmed, however, when he arrived at 2:45. Yvonne was nowhere to be found, but her purse, partially eaten lunch, cigarettes, and book were still there. He called over to the North Olmsted station, and the manager, who had seen Yvonne less than 3 hours earlier, rushed over to help look for her. When he and the other employee could not find her, they called police at 3:30. There were no signs of a struggle inside the station, and there was still $300 in cash in the register. Police theorized that Yvonne had been abducted while she was outside, potentially when she had gone out to pump a customer's gas. More than 100 tips were investigated in the following years. Local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies were involved in the investigation. Numerous persons of interest were identified, but without finding Yvonne or her body, police could only theorize about what had potentially been done to her. Years and then decades passed without any answers in the case. Passage of time did not diminish Yvonne's family's desire for answers. In 2014, one of her family members asked to provide a DNA sample so that Yvonne's remains could be identified should they ever be located. This led to a renewed effort by authorities in the investigation. Police went back and re-interviewed all of the witnesses in the case. In 2016, on the 39th anniversary of Yvonne's disappearance, the Fairview Park Police Department announced that during this process, they had identified a potential person of interest in the case. This man was known to police and had previously been connected to crimes of a similar nature to Yvonne's case. Police made this news public in hopes of encouraging new witnesses to come forward with tips that could potentially help them confirm or refute this individual's involvement in Yvonne's disappearance. The effort did not result in the case being solved. In 2021, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children released an age-progressed image of what Yvonne may look like at the age of 62. Everyone is doing what they need to be doing on the police side. On my side, all I can do is hope that there will be closure, Yvonne's brother Dan said in 2022. Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. 29-year-old Vita Lou Powers was a dependable employee of St. Thomas West Hospital in Nashville, Tennessee, and the dedicated mother of 2 children. She was very close with her family and was always willing to help them. Vita began May 26, 1982 as normal, sticking to her usual routine. She left her home on 9th Avenue South and dropped her children off at daycare. She then drove over to her sister's house to pick her up and give her a ride to her job at the Continental Insurance office. It was at this point in the morning where Vita began deviating from her routine. During the drive to the insurance office, Vita told her sister that she had taken the day off from work, so instead of driving to the hospital after dropping her off, she would be going home and going back to bed. Vita's sister would be the last known person to see her. Vita did not pick up her children from daycare that afternoon, which was unheard of for her. Her family was notified and the search for her quickly began. She was not at home and neither was her car. In Orange, 1975, Chevrolet Monza, a formal police report was taken on May 28th and police joined the search. Vita's car was located on May 30th, abandoned on 14th Street South near Edge Hill Avenue, just a few blocks away from her home. According to police, the location was unusual, and it appeared that someone had tried to conceal the car so that it would not be found right away. Vita's purse and eyeglasses were found inside the vehicle. This was concerning because Vita had very poor eyesight and relied heavily on her glasses. The glasses being left behind led police to believe that foul play was involved in Vita's disappearance. Police do have a person of interest in the case, but not enough evidence to conclusively tie him to Vita's disappearance. The month of May continues to be difficult for Vita's 2 children because it marks the anniversary of her disappearance, as well as her birthday and Mother's Day. Vita's daughter, Yolanda, who was just 9 years old when her mother went missing, continues to search for her mother and hopes that anyone who knew her mother at the time she vanished, or as even the smallest piece of information, will come forward. I'm just keeping it positive. Every day, the Lord wakes me up is a day for me to try and find her, Yolanda said in 2023. Jason Knapp was a native of York, Pennsylvania. He was hardworking and smart. He was also a perfectionist from a young age, once crying for 3 days because he got a bad grade on a test in elementary school. As he got older, his commitment to excellence quickly paid off. He played 3 sports in high school and had lots of friends, to whom he was very loyal. He was accepted into the mechanical engineering program at Clemson University in South Carolina. He was a member of the ROTC, and in 1998, 20-year-old Jason was pledged into the National Society of Pershing Rifles, a national military honor society. His hobbies also required a great amount of skill, as he enjoyed target shooting and mountain biking. Jason normally called back home to speak to his mother Deborah in Pennsylvania every day. During their call on Saturday, April 11, 1998, he told her about his induction into the Pershing Rifles and how he and a friend had been out looking for an apartment. This would be the last time Deborah spoke to her son. Deborah did not get any calls from her son in the next few days, which was unusual, but she assumed he was busy studying in preparation for the end of the semester and making arrangements for his housing in the following school year. On April 17th, Deborah finally received a phone call, but it was not from Jason. It was from one of his roommates, informing her that no one had seen Jason all week. The last time anyone had seen Jason was the day he last spoke to his mother, Saturday, April 11th. That evening, his roommate had seen him watching a movie in their apartment. When Deborah learned of this, she immediately called police in South Carolina to report her son missing. Police officers checked local hospitals and searched Jason's apartment. The following day, Deborah and her ex-husband, Jason's father, John, traveled from Pennsylvania to South Carolina to help look for their son. On April 21st, Jason's white 1990 Chevrolet Beretta was reported to police as being parked at Table Rock State Park in Pickens, South Carolina, approximately 30 miles away from his college campus. According to the park superintendent, they had not contacted the police earlier despite the fact that the car had been there since April 12th, because there was a trail within the park that took a full week to complete. Since there was a sticker on Jason's car indicating that he was an ROTC, park staff had assumed he would have had interest in hiking such a long trail and the physical strength and skills needed to complete it. Even when the car remained untouched after a week, they believed that its owner may have been too tired to drive after completing the long hike and had gotten a ride home and planned to come back for the car at a later time. When the car was still there on the 9th day, however, they became concerned and notified the authorities, who quickly connected the car to the active missing persons case. Authorities believe Jason entered the park between 3 and 5 p.m. on Sunday, April 12th, the day after his last phone conversation with his mother. His fingerprints were found on the park ticket, so they do believe Jason was the person who drove his car to the location. Table Rock State Park consists of thousands of acres, and much of it is wilderness. An extensive search was launched in the park, and a nearby lake was drained. No signs of Jason were found despite the massive effort, which took more than 2 weeks. Police say there were no signs of foul play in the park or in Jason's car. Jason withdrew $20 from his bank account the day before he disappeared, and his bank account has not been touched since. In 2017, Jason's parents made the difficult decision to have Jason declared legally dead. His father John's health was declining and his mother had medical issues as well. They hoped that the process would give them a chance to say goodbye to Jason before they passed away. The process was completed in January of 2018. A memorial marker was installed for Jason at Susquehanna Memorial Garden in his hometown. Passed away in 2019. Even 25 years after his disappearance, investigative efforts to find Jason are ongoing. In 2022, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children released a new image of what Jason may look like today. Jason's mother, Deborah, had a bench installed in Jason's name at the Botanical Gardens at Clemson. She travels there yearly to remember her son and write him a letter, as part of her efforts to cope with his disappearance. She still hopes she will find answers about what became of her son within her lifetime. Pamela Holopainen grew up in the South Porcupine neighborhood of Timmins, a mining town in northern Ontario. Her mother, Holly Kautuk, was Inuit, and her family was originally from Nunavut. Like many Indigenous individuals in Canada, Holly was sent to a boarding school. She arrived at the school at the age of 14, and a year later she became pregnant with Pamela's older sister, Vanessa Brousseau. Pamela was born 2 years after Vanessa. Holly did her best to actively raise her daughters in their Inuit culture and teach them to embrace their heritage and their daily lives as much as possible. Since there were no other Inuit in Timmins, she was also active in the local Indigenous community, the Cree. Holly would eventually become the president of the Timmins Native Friendship Center. Pamela and Vanessa were very close growing up and relied heavily on one another. They grew up in poverty and therefore had very few toys, so they used their imaginations to make up games and activities together. Pamela was outgoing and outspoken. She had a big personality, which was also reflected in how deeply she cared for others and the great lengths she would go to help anyone who needed anything. Pamela left school prior to graduating high school so she could go to work. Following a brief stint as a waitress, she found a job in a call center where she excelled. By 2003, 22-year-old Pamela had a common-law spouse with whom she had 2 sons. She was a devoted mother. Pamela and Vanessa remained close as adults, and it was common for them to speak multiple times a day. On December 13, 2003, Pamela asked Vanessa if she could babysit her 2 boys that night. Vanessa was unable to, so Pamela made other arrangements. Vanessa went to Pamela's house on December 15th, but no one was home. She continued visiting the house over the next few days to see her sister and drop off Christmas presents for her nephews, but no one was ever at the house. Vanessa assumed that they had gone to spend Christmas with Pamela's common-law spouse's family. Pamela did not call Vanessa on Christmas Day, which Vanessa was very upset about. On December 26th, Vanessa was able to speak with Pamela's landlord. They had not seen the family either. At this point, Vanessa was still under the assumption that her sister was with her common-law spouse's family, and simply failing to call her. Vanessa learned that she was wrong on New Year's Eve. That day, Vanessa and her mother were at a bingo hall when a woman came up to them and asked if they had heard about Pamela. They said they did not, and the woman told them that Pamela had left her common-law spouse. Vanessa and Holly then asked where Pamela's children were. They were still with their father. This was an immediate indication that something was not right to Vanessa and Holly. It was conceivable that Pamela would leave her spouse. There was not even a remote possibility, however, that Pamela would go anywhere without her sons. Vanessa and Holly went to police to report Pamela missing. While they made the report as soon as they realized that something was wrong. It had been more than 2 weeks since anyone had seen Pamela. She had attended a house party on the evening of December 13th and had left it in the early morning hours of the 14th after reportedly getting into an argument with her common-law spouse and saying she would walk home. Police were not concerned about Pamela's disappearance, telling Vanessa and Holly that Pamela was probably out drinking and would reappear in a few days, a conclusion with no supporting evidence. Understandably frustrated by this disregard for Pamela's well-being, began their own search, organizing friends and family members to create and distribute flyers and to search for Pamela. For months after Pamela went missing, when police finally began investigating Pamela's disappearance, they told her family that they believed Pamela was a sex worker in Hamilton, Ontario. They supported this claim with 2 nude pictures Pamela had taken of herself, presumably for her common-law spouse, that had been found on her personal computer. The case was eventually taken over by the Ontario Provincial Police, but the investigator assigned to the case faced allegations of attempted murder and arson and spent time in jail. In 2013, the case was sent back to police in Timmins, who told Pamela's sister Vanessa that the case was not active. Pamela's mother Holly passed away on December 31st, 2007, exactly 4 years to the day after she reported her daughter missing to police. Vanessa Brousseau continues to advocate and search for her sister. She is active on social media, sharing her sister's story as well as stories of the challenges facing Indigenous people in Canada. Robert Willie Pickton. His case and subsequent trial had been particularly unsettling to me because his killing grounds were close to my hometown. He is sought to have killed upwards of 49 people and was convicted of 27. The manner in which he disposed of their bodies was also horrific. For a long time, it was something a lot of people talked about often. You just never think this kind of thing happens in your backyard. But now, the farm that once was the scene of many people's horrific end has now been paved over and is a strip mall. The world moves on, but for the victims, we should continue talking. It also serves as a reminder to a younger generation that hasn't been told to be careful because bad people can lurk in the most inconspicuous of places. Robert Pickton, who preferred to be called Willie, was born October 24th, 1949 in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia. Little is known about his childhood or family background, but it is reported that his father was absent in his childhood and he was raised by his mother, Louise Pickton. She was described as a workaholic who was tough and had eccentric tendencies in raising her children. She would work her children for long hours on the pig farm even on school days, but that wasn't entirely unusual for a smaller farming community. There is a story that Robert as a child had a pet calf who he had raised from birth. He loved this calf and he felt it was his only companion. His parents had the calf slaughtered once it was big enough and he never recovered from that grief and betrayal. Robert did not do well in school. He had been put into special education classes and eventually dropped out. He was described as having personal hygiene issues as a child and into adulthood. He smelled of manure, body odor, and dead animals. He didn't have a lot of friends, but the ones he had would beg him to bathe. But he had a visceral fear of showers due to his mother hosing him down like a dog as a child. He would only take baths. In his entire life, he had never had a girlfriend. Women were said to be repulsed by him due to the smell and his creepy demeanor. He was awkward, he had an off-putting sense of humor, and he unsettled people. He would spend most of his life in isolation. When both of his parents had passed, Pickton and his siblings sold off most of the family pig farm to urban development, reducing the farm to 6.5 hectares. After the reduction, they still maintained a small-scale livestock operation. Pickton lived on the property in a small trailer home. In 1996, he and his brother established the Piggy Palace Good Times Society, which they registered federally as a charity that had an alleged mandate to raise funds for service through special events such as dances and shows. The society would host massive parties. Neighbors complained of the rowdiness, drug use, drunkenness, and noise from parties attended by as many as 1,700 people. Frequent guests of these parties were members of the Hells Angels as well as many sex trade workers from the downtown east side. The surrounding community was not happy with what loophole to hold unsavory days-on-end gatherings, and in 2000 the city of Port Coquitlam disbanded the charity due to the brothers failing to report their financial statements. I wanted to interject for a minute and set the scene for the victims. For decades leading up to Picton being caught and all the way to this year, women were and are still going missing. Women in high-risk runaways are vulnerable, and the late 80s and 90s were a particularly scary time because the increasing frequency women were going missing and no one could figure out where they were going. Women would try to protect themselves by walking in groups, taking down license plate numbers of vehicles, but women just kept going missing, and because of the transient nature of the victims, the police did very little to investigate. The Canadian RCMP did create a special team to investigate the disappearances, but the team was disbanded in 1989 due to limited progress. In 1991, Family of Missing Women and Advocates for Sex Trade Workers established an annual Valentine's Day Remembrance Walk as a memorial to murdered and missing victims. The people of British Columbia wanted answers, and the police were sluggish to respond. And at this point, there were no bodies, so to police, these were just missing women who could have up and left. As we know now, they didn't. In 1997, Picton had actually been arrested for kidnapping and stabbing a sex trade worker. She later testified she had been picked up by Picton. He had taken her back to his property, and he had attempted to handcuff her. She was stabbed in the abdomen when she resisted being handcuffed, and she managed to wrestle the knife from him and ended up stabbing him back. Then she was able to run to a road, wave down an oncoming vehicle, and receive treatment at the hospital. Picton called an ambulance and received treatment at the same hospital, and he was later arrested there. He was charged with attempted murder, assault with a weapon, and forcible confinement, but the charges were stayed and eventually dropped because the woman, whose name was placed under the protection of the publication ban by the courts, was a drug addict and not considered to be a competent witness. Picton claimed she was just a hitchhiker who had attacked him, and he was released from prison. The police had a second opportunity to arrest Picton had they taken this next tip seriously. In the spring of 1999, an employee of the farm told the Vancouver police that a sex trade worker and drug addict named Lynn Ellingson had seen a woman's body hanging in Picton's slaughterhouse. When questioned by police, Ellingson initially denied the story. Only much later did she had in fact seen the body but didn't report it because she was afraid of Picton and also depended on him for money for drugs. This report had not been investigated by police despite Picton consenting for police to search the property. It is estimated that had the police gone to the farm, it could have saved at least 10 lives. Around this year, there had been a significant spike as Picton got more confident with killing and barely bothered hiding any potential evidence. An employee of the farm, Bill Hiscox, described the property as creepy and described Picton as exhibiting bizarre behavior that would draw negative attention to himself. He had made several connections to women he had seen on the property and women that had gone missing in the area. In '99, he informed the RCMP that several items of women's clothing, purses, and identification had been seen on the property. Missing women, and this was the second time Hiscox had contacted the police regarding these suspicions, and police did not obtain a warrant based on what they considered hearsay evidence. They told Hiscox they required an eyewitness or physical evidence. So to recap, by '99 police had an incident where a sex worker escaped an attack on the Picton property, a claim of a dead body being seen hanging in a slaughterhouse, and an employee who had made 2 claims seeing the personal effects of known missing women. Plus, well over 50 women having gone completely missing in about a 20-year period. These would later haunt the Vancouver Police Department because it was one of their greatest embarrassments as a police force. It really shone a light on the discrimination shown by the Vancouver Police and the RCMP. Had it been another demographic of women, it would likely have never gone this far. It shouldn't matter how you make a living, the color of your skin, or whatever walk of life you come from. We should all be treated equally, eyes of our justice system. No one should be forgotten, and it really is mind-blowing how long Robert Picton got away with murder. In 2002, A different former employee named Scott Chubb said that he had personally seen illegal guns on the property, and the RCMP were then able to execute a search warrant looking for illegal guns. And on February 5th, in addition to finding several unregistered and illegal weapons, they found items connecting missing women to the property. This then began the massive investigation that was seemingly never-ending. DNA profiles of both men and women were found. They never found complete bodies, only bone fragments. Teeth, hair, small bones, jaw fragments, pieces of larger bones. Police believed he was grinding up his victims and feeding them to his pigs. Position of the fragments and the sheer volume of the frag possible to help with the identification process. So, an officer was charged with befriending Pickton and to gain his trust. Pickton liked the attention. He referred to himself as a celebrity and was happy to boast to his cellmate. He revealed details about keeping victims' belongings, clothing on the farm. With that information, officers were able to identify dozens of victims. Additionally, he said to the officer, "I got a murder charge on me and 48 more. 48 more to come. Whoopee." Pickton told the undercover officer he had wanted to make it an even 50 and had only got caught because he was sloppy. It was believed he did murder 49 people. There was no reason to doubt that claim. However, Pickton would only end up facing 27 counts of murder, most of whom were either drug addicts or prostitutes. The Crown decided to try him initially for 6 murders that had the most definitive evidence so that there was a higher chance of the conviction sticking. On December 9, 2007, the jury returned with a guilty verdict of 6 counts of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced Pickton to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years, and he was later charged with the remaining 21 counts of murder. Maximum security prison. He is eligible for parole on February 22, 2027. He would be 78 years old by then. Unfortunately, Pickton could have been apprehended much sooner. The Vancouver Police Department acknowledged this in a statement during a press conference. Unfortunately, there are many victims still unidentified. 22 potential victims left anonymous. Teresa Scalf was an incredibly loving person. She turned that trait into a career, becoming a nurse, and ultimately inspiring the majority of her family to also work in healthcare. In 1986, Teresa was 29 years old and working at Lakeland Regional Health Medical Center in Lakeland, Florida. She lived in an apartment with her 8-year-old son. On October 27, 1986, Teresa's mother, Betty, received a phone call telling her that Teresa had not shown up for her shift at the hospital. Concerned, Betty drove over to her daughter's apartment around 10:30 p.m. Teresa did not answer the door. So Betty used a credit card to manipulate the lock on the door and get inside. When she got inside, Betty discovered a bloody scene and her daughter's lifeless body. Fortunately, Teresa's young son was not at home. Teresa had been stabbed to death and nearly decapitated as a result of the depth of the wounds to her neck. She also had defensive wounds showing that she had fought back against her killer. While Teresa's fight to survive did not save her life, it would ultimately identify her killer. Teresa's case did go cold, but police did not give up on it, even after decades. Cold case detective Matthew Newbold was assigned to the case in 2015. He kept Teresa's picture in his office and promised her sister Pam that he would not retire until he solved the case. He was able to uphold that promise. On October 16, 2023, Polk County Sheriff Grady Judd announced that Detective Newbold had identified Teresa's killer as Donald Douglas. Douglas had been 33 years old at the time of the murder and had lived directly behind Teresa's apartment. He had been interviewed as a part of the routine canvass of Teresa's apartment complex, but had never been a person of interest in the case. He could not be arrested for the murder because he died of natural causes at the age of 54. He had never been arrested for anything during his lifetime. Teresa's and her killer's because she had fought against him hard enough to make him bleed. DNA was extracted from that blood sample and run through the combined DNA index system sometime in the early 2000s, but no match had been found. Detective Newbold began working with Othram Inc. in 2022 to trace the unknown DNA through commercial DNA databases. Extensive genealogical work revealed that a third cousin of the killer had an affair with a neighbor in 1949, which resulted in the birth of a child. Tracing that child's family led to the identification of Douglas as a potential suspect. His remains had been cremated following his death, so Detective Newbold had no way to obtain a direct DNA sample from him or his body. Douglas did have a son, and Detective Newbold contacted him. The son was certain that his father could not have killed anyone, but was still fully cooperative with the investigation and provided a sample of his DNA. Analysis confirmed the biological relationship between him and the person whose blood was found at the crime scene. Douglas's son was shocked and horrified when he learned of what his father had done. Teresa's mother, Betty, did live to see her daughter's killer identified. "I'm 84 years old. I lived to see this done. I think that's why I lived so long," she said, following the identification of Douglas. In 1981, 14-year-old Karen Alexander and her 13-year-old brother Gordon lived in the College Hill neighborhood of Texarkana, Arkansas with their parents and were members of Trinity Baptist Church. Karen was an 8th grader at College Hill Junior High School. She was a well-behaved student who loved spelling and English. She wanted to be a nurse when she grew up. Karen was very soft-spoken, but was incredibly kind and sweet to those she did talk to. She did not like to draw a lot of attention to herself, but had a few close friends. She enjoyed trading stickers and having sleepovers with them. Gordon was far more extroverted than his older sister. The 6th grade student at Washington Middle School had a gentle but outgoing spirit. He always had a smile on his face and said good morning to everyone at school. He was not simply loud, talking just for the sake of talking, but genuinely kind to everyone around him. He gave compliments freely too, and made an effort to get to know everyone he met. Gordon had dreams of one day playing football, despite a lifetime of health problems. These health concerns and their effects, like a special shoe he had to wear to account for a difference between the length of his legs, sometimes made him a target for bullies, but their actions did not tarnish his spirit. Gordon had been born with a congenital heart defect that required him to undergo open heart surgery as an infant. Later in his life, he suffered a stroke, which resulted in the left side of his body being weakened. In April of 1981, Gordon was confined to a wheelchair. He had broken his hip approximately 3 months earlier when he fell off his bicycle and was undergoing physical therapy. He and Karen spent the night of April 7th alone at home. Their mother Vera had been admitted to Wadley Hospital the previous weekend as a mental health patient. Their father Weldon worked the night shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. at a local tire factory, Cooper Tire. Weldon called police at 7:15 a.m. on April 8th, telling them that he had come home from work to find his front door open and his 2 children having been attacked. His son was dead in the kitchen and his daughter was on her bed near the living room, potentially still alive but seriously injured. When police officers arrived 9 minutes later, Weldon told them that he had pulled a dull knife from Karen's body and placed it on a nearby bookshelf. Gordon had sustained 16 stab wounds and was deceased, but Karen was still clinging to life despite the fact that she had been beaten, strangled, and stabbed several times in the face. It would later be determined that she had been raped. She was taken to St. Michael Hospital where she remained in a coma until she died 3 days later. Her autopsy concluded that her cause of death was a stab wound to her right eye that struck her brain. The Texarkana police created a special investigative team to work the case, and they worked around the clock. All days off have been canceled. We will work full-time until this case is solved. The person who did this is an animal. We hope the courts will treat them as they would a mad dog, Texarkana Police Detective Jimmy Cowart said at the time. However, the case went cold despite their efforts. Henry Lee Lucas would later claim responsibility for the murders, but his confession, like almost all of the hundreds of confessions he made to garner attention and special treatment from law enforcement, was proven to be a lie. Gordon and Karen's mother, Vera, took her own life just 3 years after her children were killed at the age of 37. Calvin Seward was a patrolman with the Texarkana Police Department who was assigned to the Alexander investigation shortly after the murders occurred. The case was a difficult one for him as he had children the same age as Karen and Gordon, including a daughter who was one of Karen's classmates. Officer Seward was promoted to sergeant and then captain with the department before he retired from it in 2004. He went on to work with the U.S. Marshals and the Texarkana Airport Police for another 18 years before retiring again. Captain Seward had never lost his desire to solve Karen and Gordon's case. In February of 2022, he received permission to work on it on a volunteer basis. He conducted numerous interviews and reviewed several pieces of forensic evidence. He then began working with forensic criminologist Dr. Todd Steffi, as well as Kelly Dixon. A DNA scientist at the Arkansas State Crime Lab. DNA testing had last been done on the evidence from the Alexander case in 2012, and the three of them agreed that the evidence should be retested based on advancements made in the field since then. DNA was found under both Gordon and Karen's fingernails, which had been preserved. DNA was also found in semen on Karen's bedsheets. This DNA was compared to Karen and Gordon's DNA profiles. Based on the amount of DNA the suspect shared with them, it was determined that the DNA came from their father. Further investigative efforts supported Weldon Alexander being his children's killer. Trace evidence was found on Karen's body and in dried blood on Gordon's hands. It contained fibers, brass, copper, and zinc, all of which Weldon Alexander would have been exposed to at work at a tire manufacturer. Police had initially believed that the children had been killed while their father was at his overnight shift. However, Captain Seward's investigation revealed that this timeline was incorrect. He learned from the officer who first responded to the scene that Gordon's body had been cold to the touch when he arrived. Police had also originally believed that Karen and Gordon had let their killer inside and had been visiting with them before they were killed. There had been no signs of forced entry, and Police Captain Jimmy Cowart stated that he believed Karen had changed out of her nightgown and into a pair of shorts and a shirt because someone had come to the house after she had gone to bed. It was determined that Karen and Gordon had in fact been found in the clothes they had been wearing the previous day. Knowing all this, Captain Seward now believed that Weldon Alexander had attacked his children prior to leaving for work and called police pretending he found them like that. When he returned from his overnight shift, it appeared that when Weldon began raping his daughter Karen, his son Gordon, despite being in a wheelchair, tried to protect her and was killed for his bravery. Weldon Alexander had died on November 6, 2014 at the age of 80, and as such could not be arrested for killing his own children. However, Captain Seward and Dr. Steffi still submitted an affidavit of probable cause to the Miller County prosecuting attorney, naming him as the most probable suspect in the case. In a letter dated October 11, 2023, Miller County prosecuting attorney Connie Mitchell stated, "After reviewing your comprehensive report and meeting with you personally to discuss the case, your findings and theories, it is my opinion that Weldon Alexander, father to Karen Alexander and Gordon Alexander, is the sole viable suspect in their murder. I believe probable cause exists for the issuance of a warrant for 2 counts of capital murder. While this warrant could not be issued, finally having answers in the case will hopefully be beneficial to those who loved Karen and Gordon and never gave up on solving their murders." At the press conference announcing the resolution of the investigation, Police Chief Michael, "It is our hope that the friends and remaining family of Gordon and Karen Alexander may find some peace in knowing that scientific and circumstantial evidence has been revealed sufficient to resolve this 42-year-old case." Travis Vanderweel pleads guilty to misdemeanor, disorderly conduct, and resigns following a video of him kneeing and punching a suspect brought in on a theft case. The victim, Terrell James Johnson, was held by at least 5 officers, gagged and tied down to a chair while he was beaten. The incident had occurred in 2016 and he had been on paid administrative leave for the past 2 years. In the video, Johnson is seen pleading with the officers to not kill him and crying out that they were using excessive force. Vanderweel responds by saying, "You ain't seen excessive force yet." The video ends with Johnson being wheeled into a jail cell where he later pleads guilty to the theft. This video is extremely disturbing, and although a new deputy superintendent was appointed to oversee the jail, I do not think that is enough to change behavior. Although one jailer was doing the beating, 5 officers held him down and several others were standing around watching. This was not the first time. Had this video not been released, this would have continued. Despite the video, this officer was on administrative leave for 2 years. This was a racially fueled abuse of power, and they really did very little to take a stand on this behavior. My hope is that with the use of more body cams and video surveillance, as well as training new officers better, with a greater focus on de-escalating situations, we see less and less of this abuse in the future. In a law enforcement role, Chris Watts, serving 3 life sentences for the killing of his wife and 2 daughters, was interviewed by the FBI, and he provided more details about the crime. His family had gone missing back in August 2018, and he was seen pleading for their safe return. Police had discovered that Chris resented his successful wife and made plans so that he could pursue a relationship with his girlfriend. His wife had also been pregnant at the time of her murder. His daughters, Bella, was 4 and Celeste was 3. He has yet to reveal why he decided to kill his family. The FBI has released those transcripts, and if you would like a more detailed video, let me know. In a lighter story, Gwendolyn Aggard calls 911 when she hears someone attempting to get into her home. Aggard went downstairs to find a man standing near her back door with her pants on. She screamed at the man, "Mother effer, if you come any further, you're a dead son of a bee." The man continued to attempt to gain entrance, and Aggard grabbed her .38 caliber revolver to protect herself. She fired twice, and the man ran off to try another entrance. So Aggard got her bigger gun, a .48 caliber revolver. She fired twice, and the man ran off to try another entrance. So Aggard got her bigger gun, a .45 caliber revolver. She warned the burglar, "When you come down those stairs, I'm gonna blow your damn brains out," while firing a warning shot. She trapped the burglar in a corner, and the suspect hid in a closet and was arrested without incident and charged. Police released 10 minutes of the 911 call, and although Aggard told the 911 operator how terrified she was, she said that she thought of her family, and it gave her a burst of energy to stave off the would-be attacker. When interviewed, her daughter said how proud she was that her 79-year-old mother was able to be so strong and calm during the entire altercation until law enforcement were able to arrive. This month, we saw Jussie Smollett's charges dropped. In a very quick summary of the situation, Jussie Smollett, who was an actor on the show Empire, claimed on January 29th at 2 o'clock in the morning, 2 masked men beat him, yelled derogatory comments, and put his head in a noose. This led to a massive investigation which determined the suspects to be 2 Nigerian men. The men had previously worked on the set of Empire. They were later released, and then Smollett was the primary suspect. Smollett turned himself in and was charged. A grand jury indicted him on 16 felony crimes of disorderly conduct and fraud for faking a hate crime on himself. It was allegedly all conspired so that he could get a salary increase at Empire. But in a massive update, Chicago prosecutors have dropped all charges in the case. In a statement, they said, after reviewing all the facts and circumstances in the case, including Mr. Smollett's volunteer service in the community forfeit his bond to the city of Chicago, we believe this outcome is a just disposition and appropriate resolution in this case. Smollett's record will also be expunged and the court record sealed in the matter. However, they maintain that the attack did happen as Smollett described, and Smollett maintains his innocence. It is still unclear as to why the prosecutors decided to drop the case. The police, who were most shocked and surprised about this, even the mayor of Chicago was shocked, and they said in a statement that he believes Smollett was receiving special treatment and that he described it as a whitewash of justice. The mayor and police department in their joint press conference were obviously enraged. Following the press conference, the internet joined the discourse. It is odd that if he was completely innocent, why did he quietly give up his $10,000 bond money and serve community service? Smollett's own accounts of the event contradicted with what police said they saw on CCTV footage of the scene. All in all, this story doesn't really add up, and I don't think a lot of people are buying into the story that Smollett is selling. On Monday, October 15th, 2018, a call had been made from the Kloss family home, using the cell phone of Denise Kloss. While the caller didn't speak with the operator, a disturbance and yelling were heard, and then the call was disconnected. The operator tried to call back. The call went straight to voicemail. For minutes after the call was made, the police arrived on the scene. The police noticed that the door had been shot open and found James Kloss, 56, and Denise Kloss, 46, dead from gunshot wounds. Their daughter, Jamie, 13 years old, was missing. Police had been certain Jamie had been in the home during the attack based on the evidence in the 911 call and evidence in the home. No weapons were recovered and an Amber Alert was issued that afternoon. It is concluded that Jamie was abducted from the home. Tips were called in with possible sightings in Miami, but the leads quickly dried up. On January 10th, however, Jamie is found alive. Cabin she had been able to escape and flag down a driver. A 21-year-old man was arrested and charged with the murdering of Denise and James as well as kidnapping and holding Jamie. Jamie is to receive the $25,000 reward money from the FBI for saving herself. On April 6, 2018, Canada was shocked when a bus crash resulted in the deaths of 16 and injuries of 13. The bus carried a junior hockey team en route to a game. Jeskarat Singh Sidhu had failed to make a stop sign on Highway 335 in Saskatchewan, causing the team's bus to crash into the semi-truck. In January, he pleaded guilty to 16 counts of dangerous driving, resulting in death, and 13 counts of dangerous driving causing bodily harm. Experts say he will likely be deported to his home country of India, and he will be unlikely to serve jail time since he isn't a Canadian citizen. He is merely a permanent resident and his sentencing is still ongoing. Helen had been near her home in Sydney, Australia. She had been with a group of friends and 4 of her siblings outside playing for most of the afternoon. When the Karapatas children were called in for supper, Helen didn't join them. She had last been seen around 5 p.m. and the search didn't begin for hours later. It is unclear on if Helen ran away or she was abducted. Helen would be 40 years old today. Michael was 4 years old when he had vanished from an elementary school playground. His parents were playing softball in the field next to the playground, and Michael was to go to the park at the other end of the field, but he was to wait for his father. By the time his father got to the playground, Michael had vanished. Immediately, he had approximately 50 people searching for him and calling his name. His disappearance sparked the largest police investigation in Canadian history, had been received, and a $100,000 reward is still available today. It is thought he was quickly abducted. The police had eyewitnesses say they saw an older man in his 40s or 50s near the park with a van, but officers were never able to track down the man or the van. The abductor would have only had about 5 minutes to snatch Michael. Michael was last seen wearing a blue hooded jacket, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle t-shirt, blue sneakers. Michael would be 31 years old today, and his family is still hopeful that someone will recognize him from his age progression photos. Brittany Ann Beers was 6 years old when she was playing outside of her house in Sturgis, Michigan. At 7:30 p.m., she was riding her bike, and at 8:30 p.m., her mother left to run errands. Brittany's half-brother said he saw her sitting on a bench about 5 minutes after their mother had left. A witness told investigators he saw Brittany talking to an unidentified man in a red or brown mid-sized vehicle. Brittany walked over to the witness and told him that she had made a new friend, and Brittany was never seen again after that. During the investigation, it had been discovered that Brittany had been sexually abused by her stepfather and physically abused by her father. Her case had a renewed interest in 2000, when a man was arrested for child pornography possession, and in some of the photos there was a girl who resembled Brittany. It was later determined to be a girl from Texas who testified against her abusive parents and had them jailed. A woman in the area at the time of Brittany's disappearance said, Brittany was said by neighbors to be frequently neglected and people assumed she was often abused. Brittany was last seen wearing a white tank top with a floral design on it, pink tie-dyed shorts, and white sneakers. She was missing her 4 upper baby teeth at the time of her disappearance. She would be 27 years old as of today. Aaron was a year old when he was playing in the backyard of his family's home. His mother had left him alone for a few minutes, and when she came back out, Aaron had vanished. The property was near a large embankment and river, so it was thought by police that he had fallen in and drowned. His body had never been recovered, and the police dogs didn't catch his scent anywhere near the river. The police admitted to having only focused on the drowning theory and ignored up to 20 other leads in his disappearance. An extensive search of the area was done the days after his disappearance, but he was only a year old and couldn't have gotten far. Both of his parents firmly believe he was abducted. Aaron has a white birthmark on his lower abdomen, and he had an enlarged head as a child. Aaron Mitchell Anderson would be 32 today. John Jack Cummings was a student at the University of Wisconsin in 1942 when he enlisted in the Army. On January 23, 1945, his parents, Helen and Leo, received a telegraph at their home in Juneau, Wisconsin, informing them that their son was missing in action. Initial military records listed the date of Jack going missing as January 4, 1945, but this date was a few days off. Late on December 31, 1944, the German Army launched Operation Nordwind, their last large-scale offensive on the Western Front, against the U.S. 7th Army, which had been thinly spread along a 68-mile-long front line. At the time, Jack was a member of Company A, 276th Infantry Regiment, 70th Infantry Division, which had arrived at the banks of the Rhine River 2 days earlier to reinforce the Alsace area. The men of Company A were spaced out along the French side of the river in foxholes, and ordered to watch out for German soldiers across the river. They were also instructed to remove any unit patches or other identifying information from their uniforms to prevent the Germans from obtaining information about troop movements in the event any of them were captured. This order would unfortunately later make the identification of the remains of soldiers killed in action more difficult. On December 31st, 22-year-old Jack was stationed in a foxhole roughly 10 yards back from the riverbank near the French village of Neuhäusel, armed with a Browning automatic rifle. 2 of his fellow soldiers saw him there early that night, just as it was getting dark, and he reported that he was fine. Sometime later, however, they heard machine gun fire and rushed back to Jack's position. When they arrived, instead of finding Jack, they found his helmet with a bullet hole in it, and a bloody piece of skull. Jack's weapon and equipment were also gone. They were drag marks in the ground down to the river. The Army officially confirmed that Jack was dead in November of 1945. A report from the Army stated, "It can be presumed that Cummings was killed by the enemy and his body thrown into the Rhine River. Further search for the remains of this soldier would be futile." Jack's family was not so easily convinced that finding Jack's remains and having them returned home for burial was a lost cause. They received limited information from the Army as months and years passed, but tried to be active in the search for Jack's body. In 1947, Jack's mother Helen wrote to the Army about offering a reward in Germany for information that would lead them to Jack's remains. She was willing to pay for such a reward, but was asking for the Army's help in spreading information about the reward within Germany. The Army told Helen that they could not help her. Both Helen and her husband Leo would die without seeing their son's remains returned home. Leo passed away in 1963, and Helen passed away in 1972. Jack's younger sister Mary Ellen eventually married, and she and her husband had 12 children. According to one of those children, Jack's nephew, Mark Hartzheim, his grandparents rarely discussed his Uncle Jack. They just never talked about this much. That was typical, I think, of people from that generation. They compartmentalized things and internalized them, and didn't dwell on them. But I'm sure it haunted them and troubled them the rest of their lives. He told the Washington Post in 2018. It would be Mark who set in motion the events that ultimately led to Jack's remains being identified and returned to the United States. He began doing research on his uncle, and in 2014, he signed up to attend a government-sponsored meeting for family members of missing in action soldiers. Once he did so, a government historian named Ian Spurgeon was assigned to revisit Jack's case. When he began his work on Jack's case, Ian found that Jack's files had not been accessed for decades. He began using these files, the National Archives, and a Defense POW-MIA accounting agency database of locations where the remains of unidentified World War II servicemen had been recovered. Ian focused on the area where Jack had gone missing and presumably been killed, and came across an account of a soldier working for the American Graves Registration Command in a grave he had discovered in Eifsheim, Germany, right across the Rhine River from Jack's last post. In 1946, the mayor of Eifsheim told the soldier that another American soldier was buried in the area. The grave was roughly 30 yards away from the river, behind a German pillbox. It was marked with a wooden cross, on which was written, in German, "Here lies a fallen USA soldier. and the date of December 31st, 1944. The Graves registration soldier was able to speak to a former German soldier who had helped bury the American soldier and still lived in the area. He confirmed that the soldier buried in the grave was an American. The nameless soldier had been killed near New Household by members of a German raiding party that had attacked across the river on New Year's Eve of 1944. On May 10, 1946, the remains were exhumed. By this time, only the soldier's skeleton remained, and there were only scraps of his clothing left. No dog tags were found with the remains, since the soldier could not be identified. The remains were given the designation X-6454 and ultimately buried in an American cemetery in France, known today as the Lorraine American Cemetery, along with thousands of other unidentified American servicemen. Ian then began the process of filing a request with the Army to exhume the remains in order to scientifically analyze them to confirm if they belonged to Jack Cummings. He conducted further research and eliminated other soldiers as potential matches before making the formal request. The Army agreed to it, and the remains designated as X-6454 were disinterred in October of 2016 and flown to Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska for testing at a Defense POW-MIA accounting agency laboratory. The bones were examined by anthropologists, and Jack's relatives provided samples of their DNA for comparison. On July 23, 2018, Mark Hartzheim was driving his 7-year-old son to the movies when he received a phone call informing him that the remains had been confirmed to be those of his uncle, Jack Cummings. On October 13, 2018, Jack was buried with honors in Hazelhurst, Wisconsin, next to his parents. His sister, Mary Ellen, who was just 17 years old when her brother was killed, was still alive at age 91 to see her brother finally return home. Lawrence Everett Dixon was born in 1920 and was a native of South Carolina. He loved music and taught himself how to play the guitar. He had a warm and friendly personality, according to those who knew him. Lawrence eventually moved north to New York City and studied chemistry for 2 years at the City College of New York. While still in New York, he married his wife, Phyllis, in November of 1941. The following July, the couple welcomed their daughter Marla. When World War II broke out, Lawrence joined the Army Air Forces and became one of 900 African-American pilots who trained at the segregated Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama. He graduated from flight training on March 25, 1943 in Class 43C. That December, he became one of 400 Tuskegee airmen who flew overseas during the war, when he deployed to Italy with the 100th Fighter Squadron. In the following year, he flew over 60 missions and was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. Captain Dixon would have been eligible to temporarily return home on leave after flying 70 missions. At the time, wait pilots received their leave after flying 50 missions. On December 23, 1944, 24-year-old Captain Dixon took off for his 68th mission in his P-51D Mustang at Ramitelli Air Base in southern Italy. He was flying to Nazi-occupied Prague, leading a 3-plane escort of an unarmed photo reconnaissance plane. Approximately an hour into their flight, Captain Dixon radioed the other planes that he was having engine problems and his plane was losing speed. His 2 wingmen remained behind with him while the reconnaissance plane sped on. They stayed with Captain Dixon's plane as he turned around trying to head back to base. Captain Dixon then began losing altitude and started to look for somewhere to land his plane or bail out of it. Ultimately, he had to jettison the canopy of his cockpit and bail out of the aircraft. According to Second Lieutenant Robert L. Martin, he had to swerve his own plane to avoid being hit by the now unpiloted plane. And when he was able to look back out of his window, he could not see Captain Dixon's parachute or any other indication of where he had landed. At the time, he believed they were in a mountainous area near the town of Darvisio in northeastern Italy. Lieutenant Martin and the other wingmen circled the area looking for any signs of where Captain Dixon was. But heavy snow on the ground hampered their efforts and they saw nothing. They began returning to base, but turned around to look for the crash site one more time. They again saw nothing. They finally flew back to Ramitelli and reported the crash, but no further searches were launched at the time. Captain Dixon's wife, Phyllis, was notified that he was missing in action on January 8, 1945. She spent months writing to the War Department asking for updates about her husband. At first, she held out hope that he might still be alive, but in need of help, writing, "I can't even sleep for thinking about him being sick somewhere," and not having anyone to care for him properly. Months would go by without any information, leading her to say in a July letter, "Please believe me when I say I have been greatly distressed. I have tried to be brave, but it really has been an effort. I meet the mailman daily, hoping and praying for some news, but so far, none." The Army conducted investigations into Captain Dixon's crash in 1946 and 1948. The reference located other crash sites, but not Captain Dixon's. The Army declared his remains unrecoverable on September 29, 1949. Captain Dixon's wife, Phyllis, would never receive the news of her husband she tried so hard to get from the Army. She passed away on December 28, 2017, at the age of 96. Less than a year later, however, her daughter, Marla, would finally get answers about her father's fate. Phyllis had died knowing that efforts were being made to finally locate her husband's remains. In the summer of 2017, the family had been notified by the Army's past conflict reparations branch that new efforts were being launched to locate where Captain Dixon had crashed, thanks to testimony from witnesses and the examination of wartime German records. The Army had learned of a crash site with wreckage consistent with the aircraft Captain Dixon had been flying on his final mission. Records showed a crash that occurred on the day of Captain Dixon's crash, but the aircraft in question had not gone down in Italy, as the Army had believed, but just over the Austrian border near Hohenthurn. From July 11th through August 8th, 2017, the Defense POWMIA Accounting Agency, the University of New Orleans, and the University of Innsbruck excavated the crash site. Among the airplane pieces and debris at the site, they found human remains. These remains were sent to a laboratory at Offutt Air Force Base outside Omaha, Nebraska, for testing. DNA was successfully extracted from arm and leg bone fragments. Captain Dixon's daughter, as well as several other of his family members, had provided samples of their DNA for comparison, in hopes of his remains being located and conclusively identified. On July 27, 2018, the Defense Department announced that the remains had been identified as those of Captain Dixon. At the end of World War II, 27 Tuskegee Airmen were missing in action. Captain Dixon was the first of them to be located since the end of the war. That August, Michael May, the identifications chief for the Army's past conflict reparations branch, presented Captain Dixon's daughter Marla with a gold ring and an aqua-colored stone believed to have fallen from it that were found at the crash site. The ring was inscribed with her parents' initials, a heart, and the date of her father's 23rd birthday. Marla believed the ring was a gift from her mother to her father for his birthday. He had loved the color aqua. Small portions of a harmonica and a small cross found amongst the debris at the crash site were also returned to Marla. Captain Dixon's wife, Phyllis, had remarried and had 2 more children, so Marla grew up with siblings and a stepfather. However, she never stopped missing her father or feeling as though her life would have been different had she not felt the void his loss had left in her life. She was always looking for ways to connect with her father and kept his files and displayed his photographs in her home. Her father's wingman, Lieutenant Robert L. Martin, wrote her a letter detailing her father's final mission some 50 years after the war ended, so that she would know as much of his story as possible. The act of writing to you so many years after brings to me a sadness, and yet I hope it will bring you a moment of peaceful remembrance of a loving father whom you lost, Lieutenant Martin wrote. He passed away at his home in Olympia Fields, Illinois, the day before the announcement of Captain Dixon's remains being formally identified was made. He was 99 years old. Lieutenant Martin's daughter, Gabrielle, came in her father's place to honor Captain Dixon when he finally received a proper burial. On March 22, 2019, nearly 75 years after his death, Captain Dixon was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery. His daughter and the grandchildren he never got to meet were there for the service and to receive the flag from his casket. At the beginning of 1972, 9-year-old Deborah Lynn Randall was a 3rd grader at Pine Forest Elementary School and living with her family in Marietta, Georgia. She loved playing with dolls, but was also known as the queen of her neighborhood baseball team. Her favorite person to play baseball with was Melvin, one of her two older brothers. On January 13, 1972, 10-year-old Melvin was feeling sick. His mother Juanita was also not feeling well and had asked Melvin and Debbie to take the family's laundry to the Duds and Sid's laundromat half a block away from their apartment building. Melvin did not want to go because he did not feel well and his favorite television show was on. Therefore, Debbie and her stepfather Frank were the two people who went to the laundromat. Debbie put on a new pair of lavender shoes she had just gotten for Christmas and left home with Frank and the family's laundry. Debbie liked going to the laundromat because she had fun playing there. She would stack up empty detergent boxes or bring her Barbie dolls and play with other girls from the neighborhood there. When she and Frank arrived at the laundromat, Frank started loads of laundry in two machines. He then gave Debbie the change she would need to switch out the laundry once those loads finished and went home. Debbie's family expected that she would come home asking for help bringing home the laundry by 7:30. When she did not, they became concerned, especially since it was getting dark. Juanita and Frank went to the laundromat to check on her and found a spilled box of detergent on the ground near a Volkswagen parked outside of the laundromat, roughly 85 feet away from its door. Debbie was nowhere to be found. According to some girls who had been folding laundry at the laundromat, Debbie had gone outside at 7:15, telling them goodbye as she left. It soon became apparent that Debbie had been abducted. Debbie's father, John, was notified while he was at his job at the Ford Motor Company plant. The Marietta police were called, and they found small fingerprints on the Volkswagen smudged in a downward direction. Witnesses reported seeing a dark 1950s pickup truck speeding away from the area of the laundromat and driving erratically. Police eventually learned that a 12-year-old girl witnessed the actual abduction. She had not reported it immediately because she believed the little girl she saw a man grab must have been his child, who had misbehaved and was being taken home. The man nearly ran her over as he sped away, and she could briefly see him glaring back at her in the truck's rearview mirror as he drove away. Another witness saw a man driving a pickup truck, similar to the one leader seen speeding away from the scene around 7 p.m. as it parked next to the Volkswagen, where child-sized fingerprints were later found. These two witnesses were able to help develop a sketch of the driver. The official search for Debbie involved the Marietta Police Department, the Cobb County Police, and the Cobb County Sheriff's Office. In addition, the people of Marietta joined together to launch Operation Debbie, a massive search effort looking for the little girl. More than 4,000 people were ultimately involved in the search. Among the volunteers were civil defense workers, ham radio operators, and students. One of the most dedicated volunteers was Melvin Randall, who would struggle with guilt for several years over being sick and not going to the laundromat with his little sister the day she disappeared. He went door to door speaking with all of his neighbors and distributed flyers throughout the neighborhood, desperately hoping his efforts would bring Debbie home. January 29th, 16 days after Debbie disappeared, was cold and rainy, but the volunteers continued their work. A group of students from Southern Tech were searching a heavily wooded area between Windy Hill Road and the Fox Hill subdivision on Powers Ferry Road. Mike McCajon had enrolled in the school after serving with the military in Vietnam. He had been searching for several hours when he came across drag marks in the dirt around 5 p.m. When he followed them, he discovered Debbie's lifeless body. She was fully clothed, but had only her socks on her feet. Her prized lavender shoes were gone. Most of Marietta seemed to show up to honor Debbie's memory at her funeral. Thousands of people were packed into Roswell Street Baptist Church for the service. Debbie was then buried at Kennestone Memorial Park. Debbie's body was found approximately 6 miles away where she was abducted. Dr. Larry Howard of the Georgia State Crime Lab examined Debbie's body and determined that she had been raped. The most recent statements from authorities say that Debbie's cause of death was strangulation, but earlier ones state that she had been suffocated. It has been reported that Dr. Howard believed that Debbie died as the result of her killer using her coat to cover her face in an effort to muffle her screams while he raped her. A geologist was brought in to the investigation to analyze dirt samples taken from Debbie's clothing. They identified dirt from 2 different locations, one from where Debbie's body was found, and another ultimately matched to clay from the Dixie Cast and Stone Company on Powers Ferry Road. some 3 miles away from where Debbie's body was found. This led investigators to believe that Debbie was killed on the Stone Company property, and that her body had then been dumped in the wooded area, where it had been found. Brown hair was also found on Debbie's body, and the lab determined that it came from a white male, most likely between the ages of 18 and 30. Police conducted numerous interviews and followed up on hundreds of leads, but Debbie's killer remained unidentified. The death of Debbie and the lack of punishment for her killer obviously took a massive toll on her family. She was my baby, and I loved her so much. I couldn't understand why it was her instead of me. It was the way she had to go that hurt me so bad, and it still hurts. I would at least like to know who done it before I pass away. Debbie's mother Juanita said in July of 2018 as she battled leukemia. Juanita unfortunately did not get her wish to live to see her daughter's killer identified. She passed away on September 17, 2018. In accordance with her wishes, her ashes were buried alongside Debbie's body. Describing what losing Debbie felt like to reporter Jessica Knoll in 2018, Debbie's father John tearfully said, "Somebody took my baby. Tears you up. Literally, tears you up. I was like a zombie around here for a while. It's just like taking a big chunk out of your body. When I found that out, it was just like losing a part of me being gone. It was gone, and it ain't never come back, and never will it come back." John participated in the interview with Jessica Knoll because he still hoped to live to see Debbie's killer brought to justice. He believed there were people who had information on the case, and he did the interview in hopes of one of them seeing it and coming forward. He believed that if Debbie's killer was still alive and could be prosecuted, he should be executed following his conviction, because he obviously was not sorry for what he had done, as evidenced by the fact that he had never come forward. Like his ex-wife, John died without ever seeing justice for his daughter. He passed away in January of 2022, just 3 days before the 50th anniversary of Debbie's murder. While he was not alive to see it, Debbie's case would finally be solved the very next year. By the times of their deaths, Debbie's parents at least knew that police were still looking for their daughter's killer, and that technology that had not yet been available at the time of Debbie's murder was being used to hopefully solve the case. Luckily, the original investigators assigned to Debbie's case had preserved the evidence from the case very well. What would prove to be the two most useful pieces of evidence in the age of DNA testing, the hair found on Debbie's body and a small piece of cloth found next to her body, were preserved well enough to still be usable for testing, even decades after Debbie's death. In 2001, the FBI conducted testing on the hair. They could not identify Debbie's killer, but the testing did narrow the suspect pool considerably. The case was handed over to the Cobb County Cold Case Unit in 2015. That same year, the evidence in the case was sent for more DNA testing. A partial male profile was developed, but a match to it could not be found in the combined DNA index system. Investigators with the Cold Case Unit developed several strong suspects, but each was ultimately excluded by DNA. Thanks to extra funding received in 2019, further advanced DNA testing was conducted on the cloth in 2022. A familial DNA profile was developed, and investigators used genetic genealogy to search for potential suspects. The Cobb County Cold Case Unit began working with DNA Labs International in 2023. They were able to identify several relatives of the contributor of the DNA from the cloth. When authorities contacted these relatives, they agreed to provide samples of their DNA. Comparing their DNA with the DNA from the cloth helped give investigators a better idea of how each one of them was related to Debbie's killer. The potential suspect ultimately identified by this effort was deceased. In order to be absolutely sure about the identification, authorities had his body exhumed so that samples could be taken for direct DNA testing. This testing confirmed his DNA was a match to that from the crime scene. On September 18, 2023, Cobb County District Attorney Lynn D. Brody Jr. announced that Debbie's killer had been identified as William B. Rose, who had been 24 years old at the time of the murder. Rose could not be arrested because he took his own life in 1974, 2 years after Debbie was killed. Gold case investigator Roy Alter stated at the press conference announcing Rose's identification that he suspected Rose may have ended his life because he was afraid of being caught for Debbie's murder. According to Mr. Alter's conversations with Rose's family members, Rose had been worried about going to jail prior to his death, but his family had assumed his concerns stemmed from minor incidents. Rose did have a criminal record, but had only ever been arrested for alcohol-related incidents. He had not previously been a suspect in the case. It does not appear that Rose knew Debbie prior to her abduction. However, he did have relatives who lived in her apartment complex, giving him a reason to be a regular visitor there. He may have seen her playing outside during prior visits to the complex, but her murder appears to have been a crime of opportunity. Debbie's brother Melvin was present at the press conference to express his gratitude for investigators and their ongoing efforts. He was relieved both because he finally knew who took his sister from him, and because her killer was not someone his family knew. Melvin had ultimately resolved the guilt he had once felt for not being with Debbie at the laundromat that day, and he has stated that he does not hate Rose despite what he did to his sister because he had learned over the years that hating someone would do him no good. Melvin expressed sympathy towards Rose's family for the difficult time he knows they must be going through as a result of this news. Rose's identification was somewhat bittersweet for Melvin because his mother did not get to see it. However, he stated, "I wish my mother was here, but I know she knows in heaven that it's finally over." Family was very important to Byron Carr. He and his brother John were very close in age, which helped them have a strong bond, and he remained close with his parents, especially his mother, into adulthood. He also had lots of friends and enjoyed traveling. Byron was a well-liked English teacher at Montague Regional High School. According to some of his former students, he had a heart of gold and remained interested in the lives of his students. Long after they completed his class. In 1988, 36-year-old Byron was living in a house on Lapthorne Avenue in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, which he took great pride in and kept very neat. It would be in this house where Byron was killed on November 11, 1988. He was strangled with a towel and his body had later been stabbed several times. The killer had written, "I will kill again" on Byron's wall, which obviously raised concerns that more victims would follow. Byron's wallet was also missing. There were no signs of forced entry into the house, and police believe Byron and the killer had consensual sex prior to his murder. Byron was gay, but kept his sexuality private to avoid the discrimination so many others dealt with at the time. He had not even come out to his parents, despite how close they were. His murder led to him being publicly outed. Decades later, investigators would say that Byron's sexuality led to a lack of public interest and cooperation in the case. Byron's family felt this was the case as well. In 2024, Byron's brother John would say, "People were afraid for their jobs just because they were gay at the time. Being gay wasn't a great thing back in 1988 in the public eye. I can remember public officials that were very lukewarm to taking part in the investigation." Other members of the LGBTQ community in the area feared that they may be targeted by the killer as well, and the wider community's cold response to the murder of a gay man only added to their fears that they were not safe on Prince Edward Island. Jeffrey Haight is one of Byron's former students, and the gay man who left Prince Edward Island for many years because he felt safer living in a big city. In 2024, he spoke to the CBC about Byron and his murder, saying police believed the killer was bisexual, a conclusion they came to following the examination of the most important piece of evidence they had, the killer's underwear, which had been left behind at the scene. Police cut out a section from the front of the underwear to test it for DNA, and found both male and female DNA, believed to be from the owner of the underwear and a woman he had sex with. The size of the underwear indicated that the killer had a small build, as it fit very tightly when displayed on a mannequin with a 29.5-inch waist. Despite the societal unease around Byron's sexuality and murder, police did preserve evidence and investigate the crime. Hundreds of interviews were conducted over the ensuing decades. Police went to see Byron's parents every few years about the investigation, even though they rarely had substantial progress to report. Byron's case was formally reopened in October of 2007. Investigators hoped that since the LGBTQ community was becoming more accepted, witnesses who may have been scared to come forward in 1988 because it would involve disclosing their own sexuality would now be willing to speak with them. The Charlottetown Police Service also released a composite image of a suspect who attacked a gay man in Charlottetown just 2 months after Byron was killed, and was considered a person of interest in the murder. The case would remain unsolved until 2024. That January 26th, Chief Brad McConnell announced that the day before, 56-year-old Todd Joseph Galland, also known as Todd Joseph Irving, had been arrested and charged with 1 count of first-degree murder and 1 count of interfering with human remains in connection with Byron's murder. A second person had also been arrested but then released, although their potential involvement in the case is still being investigated. Police had long believed that at least 1 other man had come back with the killer to try to remove incriminating evidence from Byron's house after he was killed. In 2013, they revealed that 2 unconnected witnesses had come forward saying that a man had confessed to them that the killer had taken him back to Byron's house after the murder to get rid of evidence. The 2 witnesses came forward in 2008 and 2012 and knew details that had not been made public. The individual they reported, whose name has not been released, had been released on parole shortly before Byron was killed, had a violent criminal history, and had been a potential suspect in the murder early on in the investigation. However, he had passed away in the early 2000s, and as such could not be interviewed about who brought him to Byron's house that night. Police believed that it was when the killer brought his accomplice to the scene hours after Byron was strangled with the towel that Byron was stabbed. The note was written on the wall, and Byron's wallet was stolen. These actions were taken to confuse police. Socks had been found in Byron's kitchen trash can. Police believed that someone had worn them on their hands in the house, so that they would not leave behind any fingerprints. DNA was extracted from the inside of one of the socks, but it did not match the DNA on the underwear or the deceased reported accomplice. As such, a third individual may have been involved in the attempted cleanup and tampering with the crime scene after the murder occurred. Gallant had only been 21 years old at the time of Byron's murder. He had been living in Charlottetown in 1988, but moved to the United States after Byron was killed. He lived in Texas and Arkansas before moving back to Prince Edward Island in 2022. He was convicted of breaking and entering in Canada in 1987 and had a criminal record in the United States as well. He had been identified using genetic genealogy. Charlottetown police worked with Wyndham Forensics Group and Convergence Investigative Genetic Genealogy to identify him as the contributor of the DNA at the crime scene after familial matches to it were found in the family tree DNA and GED match databases. Gallant's lawyer, Chris Montigny, appeared in court on Gallant's behalf on February 1st. The case was adjourned until the following month to give Montigny time to review the large amount of evidence and documents in the case. He does not yet know how his client will plead to the charges he is facing. On the day Byron was buried, his mother turned to her son John and told him, "It's not really over until we know what happened and why." It was never over for her or for Byron's father, as they both passed away a few years before charges were brought in their son's case. Byron's brother John was still alive to see Gallant's arrest and was present at the press conference announcing it. He thanked police for all of their hard work and said of the arrest finally being made, "It's like a weight being lifted off you. It's hard to describe. It's just kind of a release." Carol Barrett grew up as one of 6 children on McIntyre Street in Zanesville, Ohio. She had a cheerful and spunky personality. She liked to make up her mind on her own and wasn't afraid to say what she thought. She was somewhat of a tomboy and regularly wrestled with her 3 brothers on the family's living room floor. In high school, she was a member of the concert band, the marching band, and the school radio station staff. Carol was very brave. In the summer of 1978, she jumped into the water to save her 2-year-old niece from drowning. That same year, Carol and her family went on vacation to Florida. Carol loved her time there and heard a lot about how much fun spring break was in the area. She begged her parents to let her go back to Florida for spring break the following spring, when she would be a senior in high school, but they did not allow it. Carol graduated in 1979 and went to work at a Wendy's restaurant, with the goal of saving enough money to go to Florida the following spring. Not all of her money went to her trip savings, however. She used some of it to buy sheets and glassware and towels when she had the chance. She put the various home goods she was able to acquire in her hope chest, saving them for when she married her high school sweetheart, Tom, who had joined the Navy. When Carol wanted to go to Florida with her friends from high school in the spring of, Carol began the drive to Daytona Beach shores on March 20th with her large group of friends split between two vehicles. They drove throughout the night, taking turns driving. When they arrived in Daytona Beach shores, they checked into their rooms at the Treasure Island Motel. The girls were staying in room 617 and the boys were a floor below them in room 521. The group was hanging out in the girls' room that Saturday night, shortly after 1 a.m. on Sunday morning, March 23rd. Carol and her friend Steve left the room to go walk around. On their way to the elevator, a man blocked their path. He pointed a pistol at them and told them that they were going to turn around and go back to their room. Steve told him that they did not have a key, but the man pointed the gun at Steve's face, and the three of them walked back to room 617. They knocked on the door and were led inside. The assailant followed Steve and Carol into the room and told all 8 people there at the time that he wanted their money. He made everyone undress and line up against the sliding glass door to the balcony. He spent about 45 minutes going through everyone's belongings and eventually pocketed approximately $200. Throughout that time, he periodically clicked his gun, according to one of Carol's friends. He seemed nervous over the fact that there was such a large group of people in the room. He touched them all with the barrel of his pistol to intimidate them. The assailant told the group that he would be taking one of them with him to ensure that no one called the police. He originally grabbed Carol's friend Pam, but grew frustrated when she panicked and began to sob. Carol volunteered to go in her place. She calmly did as he told her and collected her clothes. He forced the others in the room out onto the balcony and told them to stay there until 4 a.m. He would let Carol go if they did not call the police. He locked the sliding glass door and forced Carol out of the hotel room in front of him. Carol's friends did not listen to the instructions and quickly tried to get her help. Carol's friend Chris was able to climb around the block wall separating their balcony from the neighboring one and wake up the people sleeping inside that room. They called the police, but the assailant had a 20-minute head start before they arrived. On Monday morning, a passerby discovered Carol's body in a ditch line along I-95 near Jacksonville International Airport. Her white sweater had been pulled up over her head. She had been shot execution style, according to police. There were no other marks indicating that there had been any kind of struggle. 2 of Carol's friends identified her body, which was returned to Ohio and buried in the Mount Olive Cemetery. Carol's friends helped develop a sketch of what the killer looked like. He had reddish-brown hair, which was parted down the middle, a beard and mustache, a mole on his left cheek, and a long, straight nose. He wore tinted wire-rimmed glasses. Unfortunately, despite the numerous eyewitnesses to Carol's abduction, her killer was not identified and the case went cold. In August of 2017, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit reviewed the evidence in Carol's case and determined that there was enough to reopen the case. A palm print they had not been able to account for had been preserved in evidence and seemed like a clue that could tie a suspect to the murder. The case would not be closed until January of 2024. On January 25th, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office announced that the investigation had come to an end after more than 40 years. As with many other cold cases solved after decades, the identification of Carol's killer would not result in a trial. However, while most of these cases never go to court because a suspect died before their identification, in Carol's case, the man who confessed to her murder was still alive, but already serving life in prison. That man was serial killer Billy Mansfield Jr. Mansfield, had an extensive history of sexual crimes. His crimes eventually progressed to murder, with him killing 3 young women and 2 teenage girls. He killed 4 of his victims in Florida and buried their bodies in his backyard. He then went to California where he killed a 5th woman. He pled guilty to the California murder and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He also pled guilty to the 4 murders he committed in Florida to avoid being extradited there and facing the death penalty. He remains incarcerated in California and is speaking with investigators in various jurisdictions about additional cold cases. Mansfield was identified as a potential suspect in Carol's murder in 2020. He was interviewed by investigators multiple times over the following 2 years. In September of 2022, he acknowledged that he was the man depicted in the composite sketch. He later confessed to abducting Carol and to killing her. Investigators continued working on the case and consulted with the state attorney's office in the 4th Judicial Circuit about how to proceed. In January of 2024, it was decided to close Carol's case but not pursue prosecuting Mansfield for her murder, since he is incarcerated and has no chance of ever being released, as he would have to serve 4 concurrent life sentences in Florida, even if he were somehow released from his life sentence in California. Carol's parents, one of her sisters, and 2 of her brothers passed away before her case was closed. Her surviving family is grateful for the answers they have received. Carol's niece, Claire Gilligan, is ecstatic that the case is solved and relieved that her aunt's killer has been incarcerated since 1982, which prevented him from killing even more people. Burt Allen Mann loved history from an early age, with a particular focus on the history of the American Civil War. He also loved classical music and opera. He grew up in Graham, Texas, and attended the University of Texas in Austin, where he earned a Bachelor of Science degree in zoology. He also served with the U.S. Marines as a Navy corpsman in Vietnam. In 1994, 46-year-old Burt and his wife Dawn lived in the 2500 block of Stargrass Circle in South Austin, Texas. On May 12th of that year, Dawn came home to discover her husband's body lying on their floor. It appeared that a burglar had forced his way into their home through a back door, and Burt had arrived home from work while he was still inside. A struggle began near the front door, and Burt was ultimately stabbed several times. Police found the crime unusual because individuals who commit property crimes like burglary typically flee when discovered, rather than attack. The break-in and murder also occurred in the middle of the afternoon, when children would be coming home from school and adults would be arriving home from work. More than 20 detectives worked on the case over the ensuing years. Following the establishment of the Austin Police Department's Cold Case Unit in 2005, a blood stain that had been preserved from the crime scene was sent to the lab to test for DNA. The killer had apparently been injured as Burt tried to fight him off, and his blood had been left inside the house after he fled. A DNA profile was successfully developed from the blood stain, but no match to it was found in the combined DNA index system. In March of 2023, the unknown profile was sent to Bode Technology, in hopes that they could use genetic genealogy to identify a suspect. In June of that year, they did just that. The man they believed could have been Burt's killer had never been a suspect in the case. The potential suspect was a man named Kenneth Wayne Robbins, who was living in Lubbock, Texas, and working as a long-haul truck driver. Investigators made attempts to surreptitiously collect items thrown away by Robbins to test them for DNA, but they were unsuccessful. Therefore, on September 8, 2023, detectives from Austin traveled to Lubbock with a search warrant to collect a DNA sample from Robbins. They searched him with it at his work and collected the sample. He refused to speak with them. 5 days later, the Austin Police Department was contacted by Robbins' employer, who was obviously aware that the department had an interest in him. They reported that the GPS tracker in their truck that Robbins was driving at the time showed that it had been parked at a truck stop in Weatherford, Texas, and had not moved in what they considered to be a suspiciously long amount of time. Police in Austin contacted their counterparts in Weatherford and asked them to perform a welfare check. When they arrived at the truck, they found Robbins dead inside of it. His autopsy would find that he had committed suicide. On February 8, 2024, the Austin Police Department announced that they had identified Robbins as the sole person responsible for Burt's murder. The DNA sample taken from him was a match to the DNA from the crime scene, and had he not taken his own life, he would have been charged with capital murder. Not everyone in Burt's family lived to see his alleged killer identified. His father passed away in 2019, and his mother, Virginia, died just a year before the case was closed. Burt's widow and younger sister did finally learn who took Burt from them. We don't have that big question hanging over our hearts. I had really kind of given up hope that it would happen, and I'm so grateful. His sister, Kathy May, told KVUE News. She is relieved that she does not have to go through the stress of a trial, but is upset over what Robbins' family members must be going through in light of the news of his crime and his death. Sarah Yarborough had bright red hair and an ever-present smile. She loved her 2 younger brothers and regularly helped them with their homework. Sarah was very well-rounded with both a love of the arts and a knack for math and science. She had big dreams from a young age and the work ethic she would need to achieve them. Her mother Laura described Sarah as the delight of her life and said of her, "She made those of us around her better." She was a person who built bridges and brought people together, but in her own quiet way. The Arboros had moved to Federal Way, Washington when Sarah was 8 years old. In December of 1991, 16-year-old Sarah was a junior at Federal Way High School. She excelled academically and was an honors student. She had a very active social life, despite juggling academics and extensive extracurricular activities. Sarah had a few close friends, but often socialized in a large group, because she was friendly to everyone and attracted friends with her caring and energetic personality. The Arboros were members of Bible Baptist Church, and Sarah was an active member of the church youth group. Sarah loved dance and said it made her feel fully alive. She was a member of the Safety Kids, a dance group that gave performances encouraging young people not to abuse drugs or alcohol. In the summer of 1990, she had traveled to New Zealand to perform with the group. Sarah was also a member of her school's drill team. Her dedication to the team was one of the reasons she asked her parents if she could stay home while the family went out of town on Friday, December 13, 1991. They were traveling to Ocean Shores, some 2 hours away from their home, because one of Sarah's brothers was playing a soccer game there. Sarah had plans all weekend, including an important drill team competition, so she asked to stay behind. Her parents were reluctant to leave their teenager home alone, but ultimately agreed to let her stay under the condition that a friend come to stay with her on Friday night. Sarah spent the night of Friday the 13th at a basketball game with a group of friends. She and the friend, who will be sleeping over at Sarah's house, stopped for fast food and snacks on the way back to Sarah's house. When Sarah woke up the next morning on December 14, 1991, she thought she was running late for her drill team competition. She said goodbye to her friend and rushed out of the house with curlers still in her hair to drive to school to meet up with the rest of the team, to board a bus, to travel to Juanita High School in Kirkland for the competition. 13-year-old Drew Miller had also had a sleepover on the night of December 13th. His friend Adam spent the night at his house, and the two boys spent the morning of December 14th watching Saturday morning cartoons and eating cereal, before heading out to go skateboarding in the parking lot of a nearby Albertsons grocery store. Adam lived down the road from Federal Way High School and regularly jumped over a fence so he could cut through the school's campus to get to the Albertsons. He and Adam followed that routine that morning. Because it was so cold, puddles had frozen over, so the two boys stomped on the ice to break it as they made their way across the school grounds. When Drew looked up ahead, he saw a man come out of the bushes and start walking in the same direction he and Adam were traveling. He tried to tell himself that the man had just hidden in the bushes to smoke marijuana without being seen, but his presence still unnerved him. So he kept an eye on him as he and Adam kept walking. When Drew and Adam reached the spot where they had initially seen the man pop up from the bushes, they found something horrifying. A young woman, partially clothed, staring up at them, unmoving. When they looked back up, they saw the man up ahead standing near a vehicle, staring them down. The two boys turned and ran back to Drew's house. His mother called 911 while his stepfather rushed back to the scene with Drew to see if they could help the young woman. When they arrived, they confirmed that there was nothing they could do to help her. She was soon identified as Sarah Yarbrough. It turned out that Sarah had been wrong about the time she needed to be at school to catch the bus to the competition and had actually arrived at the school early. A witness saw her pull into the school's parking lot around 8 to 10 a.m., but members of the drill team did not need to be there until 9. Her body had been found between 100 and 150 yards away from her car. There was no obvious reason why she would have gone down to the area, which was covered in bushes. There were also no signs of a struggle in or near her vehicle, where a large jug of orange juice Sarah had brought with her sat unspilled on the front passenger seat. Because Sarah was always willing to help anyone, including strangers, it was theorized early on that someone may have approached her asking for assistance, and she walked away from her vehicle trying to help them with something. Sarah's cause of death was found to be ligature strangulation, and her own nylon stockings were found around her neck. Police believed Sarah's murder had been sexually motivated, as semen was found on her clothing. DNA from it would eventually be found to be a mashed DNA found under Sarah's fingernails and on the nylons used to strangle her. Early on in the investigation, the most important lead police had was the two boys, Adam and Drew, who had seen a man leaving the scene just after Sarah was killed. The two boys were able to work with a sketch artist to produce an image of what the man looked like, which they said was highly accurate. The sketch was posted all over town and generated thousands of calls to police, none of which led to an arrest. In June of 1993, a memorial to Sarah was dedicated in the courtyard of Federal Way High School. The stone bench was inscribed with Sarah's life motto, Carpe Diem, which means seize the day, and featured a bronze statue representing some of the things Sarah loved the most: her ballet shoes, books, and her dog Gibby. June 12, 1993 was graduation day at Federal Way High School. It also would have been Sarah's 18th birthday. Sarah had dreamed of going to a college somewhere far away from Washington to explore somewhere new. She hadn't fully settled on a career path, but was considering becoming a museum curator or an engineer, like her father. Sarah's mother Laura did not sit at home with her own pain on that day, instead going to the graduation ceremony to support Sarah's many friends, as Sarah would have wanted. Years passed without answers in Sarah's case, but they also brought new technology and new avenues of investigation. In December of 2011, Sarah's case made history in a field which would eventually solve her case. While other cases would be solved using consumer DNA databases and genetic genealogy before Sarah's killer was identified, Sarah's case is believed to be the first cold case to find a lead by searching consumer DNA databases. Colleen Fitzpatrick of Identifiers International was not able to identify a potential suspect by comparing the DNA from Sarah's crime scene to the DNA profiles available in commercial databases at the time. However, she also used YSTR analysis, which looks at the Y chromosome and therefore male lineage. A match was found and showed that Sarah's killer was a descendant of Robert Fuller, who lived in Salem, Massachusetts in the 1630s and whose family arrived in North America on the Mayflower. Because they shared a Y chromosome, the killer had to be a direct male descendant of Robert Fuller. The chromosome had been passed from father to son since the 17th century, until Sarah's killer inherited it. Given the number of generations who had lived and died since Robert Fuller's lifetime, this still left thousands of potential suspects. The surname of Fuller did have a connection to Sarah's case. Bill Fuller was a close family friend of the Yarboroughs. He had led the effort to have the memorial to her installed at Federal Way High School. While he did not match the description of the man the two boys who found Sarah's body saw leaving the scene, police still requested that he provide a sample of his DNA, which he willingly did. It was not a match to the crime scene DNA. However, his Y chromosome was a match to the crime scene DNA and the known Fuller family, who arrived on the Mayflower. Bill Fuller was a paternal cousin of the killer, but too distant of one to identify him. Other individuals with the surname of Fuller living in the area were investigated, but not tied to Sarah's murder. Genetic genealogy continued to be utilized in the case, and in 2019, it finally narrowed down the potential suspect pool to two brothers, either of which could have been the killer based on their DNA. However, one of the brothers was then excluded because his DNA profile was already in the criminal database and found not to be a match. Police began surveilling the other brother and collected 2 cigarette butts and a napkin he discarded. A DNA profile was developed from these items. It was found to be a match to the DNA collected from Sarah's body. On October 3, 2019, a first-degree murder charge was filed against 55-year-old Patrick Leon Nicholas. The filing documents alleged that Nicholas killed Sarah while committing or attempting to commit the crime of rape in the second degree. Nicholas was booked into King County Jail the same day, with prosecutors requesting his bail be set at $5 million. Nicholas did not have the surname of Fuller, despite being of direct male Fuller genetic lineage, as had been previously predicted, because his grandfather had been adopted. Nicholas did have a disturbing criminal history. In June of 1983, he had attacked a young woman named Crony as she sat outside of her car overlooking the Columbia River in Ridgeland, Washington. After making small talk with her for a few minutes, he held a knife to her throat as she attempted to leave. He forced her to remove her clothing and walk down closer to the river, and was able to escape by jumping into the water and swimming away. Before he could leave town, Nicholas was only 19 years old at the time of his attack but he had been convicted of 2 rapes and an attempted rape as a juvenile. In these cases, he had used the threat of violence to get his victims away from where he first interacted with them into a more remote area where he raped them, much like he had attempted to do and he had been released from custody for his most recent crime just a few months before he attempted to rape and he pled guilty to 1 charge of first-degree attempted rape in Anne's case, and she spoke at his sentencing hearing. She requested that the judge sentence Nicholas to the maximum sentence. The judge did so, sentencing Nicholas to 10 years in prison. However, Nicholas was released after serving just 3.5 years of his 10-year sentence. Had he served his entire sentence, he would have still been incarcerated at the time of Sarah Yarbrough's murder. Years after Sarah was murdered at the end of 1993, he was arrested again. This time he was charged with molesting his 6-year-old stepdaughter. Nicholas was ultimately able to plead the charges against him down to just 1 4th-degree assault charge. Despite the nature of his criminal history, Nicholas's DNA was never entered into any criminal database. According to state law, his DNA should have been entered into the combined DNA index system following the 1993 molestation arrest, but since he was able to plead down to a gross misdemeanor, he also avoided having to fulfill this requirement. That being said, it would have still been possible for Nicholas to have been identified using DNA more than a decade before he was finally arrested, were it not for limitations in place in the state of Washington. Numerous other states, as well as the United Kingdom, allow law enforcement to utilize familial DNA analysis in their investigations. The legal statutes of the state of Washington do not allow for such analysis to be utilized there. Familial DNA analysis and investigative genetic genealogy, the process which ultimately identified Nicholas, involve essentially the same process, but they are considered 2 separate investigative techniques because of one major difference. Both techniques involve comparing a DNA profile from a crime scene to other DNA profiles in a database. Investigators identify individuals who share DNA with the suspect DNA, and then work to determine how they are related based on how much DNA they share. In the majority of cases, only distant cousins are identified, meaning investigators have to use records to construct the family trees of these individuals in order to narrow down their suspect pool. The difference between investigative genetic genealogy and familial DNA analysis is that the former uses databases of customers of commercial DNA sites who generally use these services to explore their ancestry or find long-lost relatives, and the latter uses criminal databases. In what is perhaps the most famous use of familial DNA analysis, Lonnie David Franklin Jr., the so-called Grim Sleeper, was identified because his son Christopher's DNA had been entered into the criminal database following a weapons charge and showed up as a partial match to DNA from the Grim Sleeper investigation. Patrick Nicholas has an older brother, Edward Peter Nicholas Jr., who is a convicted rapist and registered sex offender. His DNA was entered into the combined DNA index system in October of 2005, 14 years before Sarah Yarbrough's case had been solved. Had familial DNA analysis been available to investigators working on Sarah's case, Patrick Nicholas would have been identified as a suspect in her case essentially instantaneously, according to investigators, because of how closely he was related to someone in the criminal database. Because familial searches are not performed by the Washington State Patrol crime labs, Patrick Nicholas remained free for 14 more years. According to Chris Loftus, the Director of Communications for the Washington State Patrol Crime Labs, familial DNA analysis is being evaluated for use in Washington State. However, the Washington State Legislature has directed the labs to process the more than 9,000 backlogged rape kits in the state, placing the adoption of new techniques on the back burner for the time being. Furthermore, he maintains that familial DNA analysis presents legal, practical, and ethical issues for them to address, although the technique has not faced any major legal challenges despite widespread use in other states. Nicholas's trial began on April 17, 2023. His attorney, David Montez, based his defense of Nicholas on attacking 2 things: genetic genealogy and the witness testimony. He criticized the use of genetic genealogy in the case because it has only come into use so recently. Although this critique did not explain how his client's DNA, which was compared directly to the crime scene DNA after he was identified using genetic genealogy, ended up on Sarah's body. Montez also argued that his client could not have been the man Drew Miller and his friend Adam saw just before they discovered Sarah's body. Despite similarities between the composite sketch they helped develop and photos of Nicholas when he was younger, the boys told the sketch artist that the man they saw had uneven skin on his face, whether from acne, scarring, or dirt. Because Nicholas had clear skin at the time, Montez argued that he could not have been the man the boys saw, despite their testimony in court that they believed he was. It is also worth noting that the DNA found under Sarah's fingernails, as well as other evidence found at the crime scene, indicates that she fought fiercely against her killer. It is therefore possible that she may have scratched him on the face. While this is just a theory, the textured skin Adam and Drew reported seeing on Nicholas may have actually been scratch marks left by Sarah as she tried to fight him off. The trial went on for 2.5 weeks. Jurors deliberated for a day and a half before returning with a verdict on May 10th. They had been sentenced to deliberation with 3 charges to consider: premeditated first-degree murder committed during the commission of an attempted rape, and the lesser charge of second-degree murder while also committing indecent liberties. They found Nicholas not guilty of the first charge, but guilty of the remaining 2. Nicholas' sentencing hearing was held on May 25, 2023. His lawyer argued for a sentence of 20 years in prison. Because the jury had returned a special verdict, finding that Sarah's killing was sexually motivated, King County Superior Court Judge Josephine Wiggs instead handed down the sentence recommended by prosecutors more than 45.5 years. This sentence all but ensures that Nicholas will die while incarcerated. Nicholas plans to file an appeal. While decades had passed between the time when Sarah was murdered and when Nicholas was sentenced, dozens of people connected to Sarah and to her case were present at the sentencing hearing. And Crony, who had been attacked by Nicholas in 1983, had not been allowed to testify at his trial, but came to give a victim impact statement. Sarah's family members and numerous friends also gave statements, detailing how the passage of time had not diminished the love they felt for Sarah, or the agony they felt over her loss. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.